Welcome to the Humorless Lot podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only. We do not represent the U.S. Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. As the hosts of this podcast, we also understand the risk we are undertaking by expressing our opinions, but we do so for the betterment of our 0402 community. If you have any concerns about anything you hear, please contact the producer listed in the podcast description. We hope you enjoy the show and that you'll look into our other community tools on Facebook, Discord, and Teams. Thanks for being here. Semper Fidelis.
All right. Welcome to this episode of the Humorless Lot. This is episode 2, and we're talking Infantry Battalion S-4s. We've got Jess, we've got Scott, and we've got Dan on the line tonight, and we are talking through what it is like to be a logistics officer from the perspective of an S-4 in an infantry battalion. Scott, if you want to just give a little bit of background on where your perspective is coming from as a logistics officer and how you're contributing to the conversation tonight.
Yes, I would say the first perspective would probably be from the CLB 7 perspective, having worked for Kevin, hopefully, and multiple other infantry battalion logos out in the 7th Marines. Like you said, you're standing in the firing lines. I think from the 3 years that I was there, both in combat and peacetime, I think we saw 4 or 5 battalion 4s get fired, which is just tells you how hard it can be. Then from there I was a battalion 4 at 2-3 in Hawaii for 2 UDPs to Okinawa, Japan, Korea. Did the LF Karat mission, Freedom Banner, lots of good times there. And then actually currently as a reservist, I am the S4 at 123 out of Houston as a major. So different, funny perspective there.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. Dan, can you give us what your perspective is going to be?
Hey, so I'm Dan. I was a Infantry Battalion S-4 for 3 years on the East Coast. It was my second tour, so right as a brand newly promoted captain, went straight to being the S-4. That's what I thought I wanted at the time, and found out it was a lot more than I wanted. And I did 2 deployments, both peacetime, so it was from 17 to 20. B-Serve, which doesn't exist anymore, and then which is the Black Sea Rotational Force, and then I also did a UDP to Okinawa. So got to do 2 ITXs in that time frame, and all of the battalion workups are related to that. But definitely a billet, the longest billet I've ever had in the Marine Corps, being an S-4 for 3 years. So that's me.
The perspective of a peacetime S-4 is arguably more important at this point in the Marine Corps in our cycle as we're moving away from OEF and OIF than it is to hear us counterterrorism, counterinsurgent guys like doing stuff in the deserts. So Dan, it'll be great to get your perspectives on this and hear what it's like. Okay, Jess.
Hey there, everybody. So as I mentioned in the first podcast, I was an S-4 OIC for Combat Logistics Battalion 6 OEF. And then I was also the S-4 for Mouse 31 down in Beaufort, South Carolina. So not necessarily infantry battalion, but just a different perspective. And then how those also contributed to those who were in direct support of the infantry battalions.
I have a little bit of background on this. I cut my teeth in 7th Marines and spent my first 4 years in the Marine Corps as a logistics officer in an infantry battalion. So I've, of course, got some perspectives on this, and I'm really excited to talk through it. Often it is said that the rubber meets the road in an infantry battalion. We are all here to support the riflemen, and that is literally the place where a logistics officer stands on the firing line and hands bullets to the riflemen. So I'm really looking forward to this. We got some good topics tonight from our outline, some main threads that you can look forward to. Biggest lessons, things that we wish we had known when we started our jobs in an infantry battalion. Managing lieutenants for the first time, possibly, what it's like to have lieutenants working for you and having Marines within an S-4 shop working for you, working with other units. So how do you balance those capabilities as an infantry battalion S4? How do you manage expectations within an infantry battalion to make sure that your bosses all understand what capabilities are brought to the table? Because often they're looking at the logistics officer to balance all of those different capabilities. The logistics support request or transportation support request, I think this will be interesting because there are different perspectives depending on the coast, depending on the unit, how we manage that. Is it electronic? Is it a paper thing? What is an ALOC? How does that work in infantry battalion? That'll be good to talk through. And then the last section is just a venting session, and that'll probably be the most interesting. Okay, so we'll move to the first big thread for tonight. Biggest lessons, things I wish I had known going into the job as an S4. And the first topic that we have up tonight is the Annex D as a functional tool for planning, execution, and historical reference.
I'll just do a shameless plug. If we actually wrote and utilized the Annex D, how I believe it's supposed to be used, which is a functional plan, so like an order to, I consider it like your op order to your sections. You know what I mean? And like when you're talking about supporting agencies that are higher and are adjacent, what you're talking about is different capabilities that you can reach out to. So, and what capabilities they have that you can tap into, which is very important. And at the same time, as you're giving kind of orders down to your sections as far as what their tasks and how you view their functional capabilities and how they're supposed to be used. I think it would be, if we documented that, and however you want to call it, we can call it Annex D, you can call it a concept of support. When I was with SOCOM, I went to different countries and I called it logistics playbook. It was essentially just covering the functions of logistics, classes of supply, and your external, your adjacent, your internal capabilities. So it's just my plug. If it's hard to do, but if we can do them correctly and write them out right, these things are going to be they'll really help out. Like the 4s that are coming in, and also 4s that are just around. Like, hey, check out my Annex D. I'm from 29 Palms. It tells you all what ISD does, what ESD does, all that stuff. So that's my perspective.
Dan?
Yeah, so I think I went on the long journey from kind of getting an old Annex D from someone and roughly changing happy to glad, and then publishing it as part of the op order when the OPSO asked for the annexes and no one reading it. And I think that's probably a common thread. And I think Scott alluded to that. If you treat it more as something to your section and other external agencies, a lot of what you write is going to be read and used by them more so than anyone else in the unit, or even the infantry battalion you're supporting. But for me, I kind of at the end found more of a sweet spot, making sure format for a rapid request or whatever format you're using for things that the battalion's going to use to communicate with the 4. I would make sure that I emphasize that at the end and made a piece of that that I could hand out to company commanders or emphasize to the XOs, so that way they would get something that's like, hey, here's how I want you to communicate with me so that I can get what I need from you information wise. Because otherwise, a lot of times you'll get left in the dark, or they'll give you 3 lines of it's broken, I don't know where it is, or and I haven't tried to fix it, and that doesn't help you a whole lot, right? When you're trying to gather information. So and support, because that's what you're trying to do. If you help them know how to support you better, then it helps you support them in the long run. But yeah, and concept of logistics support is another way I've seen it used. You can do it in PowerPoint, you can do it in Excel and Word, kind of however the OPSO is doing the thing at the time. But yeah, I'd agree with Scott. I think if you can focus also on how you are telling the rest of your sections, tasking them, the MMO, the S4 Alpha, Motor T, especially, the rest of your pieces that are functioning, I think that's a good way to look at it as well.
Jess, perspectives from CLB side.
So unfortunately, it wasn't until I got to the IA billet that I had at Cold Response that I actually even dealt with an Annex D. And I think that's what's unique to a CLB is because everyone is a logistician. As the S4, you were looking down and in to support that unit versus your OPSA who's looking up and out. And so they're the ones who are going to be responsible for that. So that's a little bit unique from the CLB side. And then from the MALS 31 side, unfortunately, no one's ever really going to ask you for that because they're only concerned with aviation support, which is fine. That is their job. That is their mission. So I think one way that you can get buy-in, if you will, is shop your Annex D around. Like take it to those other agencies so they know that it's there and ask them, hey, do you actually understand this? Because if you don't, then it's no good to me either because I'm not going to get what I need from you to support you. As you go up as well, I think it also depends on how your boss and your cohorts receive information that's very important. Do they want it in a 5-paragraph order or do they want it in a Coles? Absolutely, you have to do the Annex D, but maybe you do more references to a PowerPoint because that is how they like to see that type of information is through a Coles. So I would say it's just a little bit more unique once you move outside of the infantry battalion.
Yeah, that's really good. And Dan brought up a great point. And doing 2 years as an infantry battalion for, great point of like when you first started, right? Because my first tour was, I was just trying to not die or drown, right? So, and then the second time around, it's kind of, I'm gonna say Groundhog Day. I'm sure we'll get down that rabbit hole, but you have a little bit more time to actually focus on this stuff. So for the people that are that are infantry battalion 4s now, and you're going into your tour, don't think you're going to have time to perfect all this stuff. But external agencies be able to look at it and see what you're doing. It's a great point.
I will second the nobody reads the Annex D. And I think that as I've been in the Marine Corps longer, Dan and I have talked about this a little bit with like reports and stuff floating around. Now that he and I are both at kind of like a higher headquarters level of Marine Corps, right? We're kind of in the headquarters Marine Corps or the joint world. Writing your reports, writing your experimentation plans or whatever, it's important to understand the audience that you're trying to write it to, right? And when you write an Annex D, I never thought about this when I was writing Annex Ds, right? And usually I was helping write Annex Ds from an OPSO position. Like that was my most experience. Jess, I agree with you. Like we did an Annex D when I was in the 4 shop in infantry battalion, but it was usually kind of copy and paste. I was in an enhanced Mojave Viper, right? EMV into ITX. And it was very much, hey, who was the battalion that was in the chute before us? Just take it and change 2-7 to 3-4, right? Like change it to whatever battalion it was. And it's like, you would miss it sometimes and people would be like, what battalion are we? So the Annex Ds kind of got recycled from one battalion to another. Unfortunately, when I was in infantry battalion, when I went to a Marine Wing support squadron where I was now the 3, and I was coming out of WTI where now I'm a 70-77 and everybody expects you to know everything about unit training management, right? You had to know how to write an Annex D. You had to know how to do orders writing. And so I often found myself as a captain S3 teaching people how to write orders, how to put the orders together, or they were coming out of an experience of being in an infantry battalion like I was, or out of a battalion where nobody did orders because nobody felt like they were effective because they were just copy and pasted from other places.
So I think that's really important as well, that you have to get practice in it. So you have to get past the fact that, yes, maybe somebody's not going to read this and it's going to be very irritating when they come up to you and ask, how do I do X, Y, or Z? And you're like, it's in the Annex D, but that's fine. Let's go over it together. The important thing is, though, is getting that practice in for yourself. So when you do get to a unit that has never had an Annex D before and is looking to you for the answers, you can spit one out fairly quickly that's actually intelligible and can get the thing done.
So who's that band that used to put no green M&Ms in the bowl? Do you know what I'm talking about? So there was a
Metallica?
band. No, it was close. It was close. It might be. Anyway, they had
It's Van Halen.
Van Halen. They showed up. They would show up to the show, and if there was green M&Ms in the bowl, like in their little party room or whatever, they would cancel the show. And like it was part of like some subsection in the contract, and it was their sound and lighting was so intricate, and they wanted it to be perfect that they wanted to make sure that you read through their entire contract for the venue. So one fun thing I did in the Annex Ds and the OPSO, both my OPSOs let me do it, probably because they didn't read it. No, they read it. I know they did. Was I would put like, it would say like admin and logistics. You put like, and uniform of the day is a wife beater with a cowboy hat. Like this is my ITX Annex D, right? Something just to see if anybody actually read it. And to your point of nobody reading it except for my shop, because I wrote their fit reps, I guess. The was you would know like some company gunny would go, like he would come back and I'm like, oh shoot, Master Guns, now Master Guns. I'm like, you read my Annex D. Thank you, man. Guess what? You're getting extra cutie pies in your hot chow. So it was a fun one. Just brought that out.
Jess brought something up. The practice is definitely important because that's how you develop, making it readable. And it's also how you write out your plan. If you never write an Annex D and you just copied and pasted and changed, and that's what I did, probably FEX 1, FEX 2, FEX 3. I think the first 3 FEXs I did, I just changed the, unit name around, changed the date. And then I think the OPSO didn't even ask for it. Like the OPSO didn't even come to me and say, hey, where's your Annex D? Partly because the OPSO didn't really know what they were doing either. But that's another side story. But that's part of it, is like if you write down your entire plan as you're writing, you go, well, I'm expecting the MMO or someone to do some task. It just doesn't make sense. Or I thought I had thought this through every single detail of it, but I can't write about it, which means that I probably haven't thought it through. So I thought that was a good point. Like practice it anyway, even if no one even wants to read it, which maybe they don't. And now you also have a document to say, hey, well, I wrote this and no one read it, but it did say it in here that you should have done this. So
to that point too, what it does as well as it makes you look up and out and realize the other resources that are available that you wouldn't have looked into had you not actually done the Annex D. And I think that's super important, especially as you go to other training facilities like Fort Bragg. Very different way to get fuel, as I found out as a first lieutenant at CLB 6. You can't just use your gas card. You actually have to go through a whole MIPR process. That was really devastating to find out after we had already gotten there, but that's besides the point. And little things like that, it does, like you're saying, force you to go, okay, oops, that's something I didn't realize, but I caught it now instead of later.
In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable, right? I think that sums up a lot of what we just said. That was Eisenhower. The Annex D is, it's a structure by which it's something that we can deviate from, right? So it's something that we get on paper. We try to get everybody on board. It gets skin in the game, especially within the foreshop, to push our staff to think through and image what the plan is going to be, how we are supporting the plan and how we're supporting the scheme of maneuver. It forces us to put it on paper. It doesn't mean that we are bound to it, but it does mean that we have something to deviate from.
Yes.
When the plan changes, right? Good. So
yeah,
Annex D.
Doctrinally sound, not bound.
Yeah, good. The next thing that we're going to talk about, the roles of the S-4, the 4 Alpha, and the 4 Chief. And then if there's any other billets within the 4 Shop and Infantry Battalion that we want to talk through, we'll go through that.
Looking at what Dan wrote, I think we had this very similar concept on this, Dan. It was like, for me, it was more like a FOPS. Like I was in the hip pocket of the OPSO everywhere you went. So in 3rd Marines, you're really kind of 12 months out because you're flying everywhere. So you're doing SAM requests and you're doing budgeting for money, because you fly the entire battalion reinforced to the Pukala training area, to a different island, and then you fly to Bridgeport, then you fly to ITX, and obviously you're flying to Okinawa, and you're kind of rinse and repeat that cycle. So you're budgeting way farther out than I thought I would need it to. But then that put the 4 Alpha really 2 weeks out, I would say 2 to 3 weeks out, give me in time. And then the chief would be this week. So really, if it came down to, I was like, if I'm sitting in a training meeting, which as the 4, you probably shouldn't be, depending on the training horizon, you should probably be with the OPSO. But I had no idea what was going on this week. That was 2 weeks ago. I don't know what time the buses are. Like, I know they're locked on because my chief's back briefing me, but I'm focused on like capability sets that we need to request and resource shortfalls for 2 fexes from now. My alphas, he's taken the kind of documents that we've come up together, and he's starting to execute and plan on plugging stuff up in the regiment, filling out formats and pieces of paper and all that stuff while chief is driving the day. So that was kind of my experience. It worked out extremely well just because there's just so much to do, I think, at a time.
Yeah, I think we all kind of see this a similar way with the FOPS COPS relationship with the 4 Alpha. Maybe it could be said, the S-4 chief is probably sometimes even in the next 12 to 24 hours, depending on what you're doing. I mean, maybe it's my 4 chief is like making sure the A drivers show up to the motor pool ahead of time to get in the 7 tons to pick up, Alpha Company. That kind of thing is kind of how the chief was kind of also the shortstop, is the way I think I was, as I was writing my thoughts after being a 4, someone asked me kind of what my time was like and had sent me some questions. I was responding to them, and the 4 chief is kind of does a lot of things, and sometimes they're not prepared to do that. Sometimes they are, and we can have a whole another conversation about kind of, development of your staff. But as a 4, definitely in the OPSO's hip pocket, and trying to give the OPSO the rudder steer, 3, 4, 6 months out of, hey, sir, we're going to DFT in Fort Pickett, and we're going to have to convoy up there. It's going to take 10 hours. Like, here's some things we probably need to think about, while we're getting there, or how we're going to do this, and how much stuff we can take, and what we're going to have to request from other external units, to make sure the OPSO is also knowing how they're going to have to go through the ops channels to do that. But I think I definitely stayed in the OPSO's hip pocket, and then the 4 Alpha was very close to the boat, doing a lot of that stuff that's close. But the only other thing I would say about that is, and maybe this is a deviation, but it kind of also depends on, staff capability, right? And understanding. I think I spent probably a lot of times where I knew every ammunition operation, everything we were doing with ammunition, like to the hour for the next like 2 weeks, because my corporal, so this is the other thing, my corporal ammo chief, right? So we have a corporal responsible for the ammo for an entire battalion, which is insane. And we'll talk about that later, but I had to kind of be in that zone for probably 2 weeks, a month, or however long it took to make sure it was stood up right, and the 4 Alpha was running it properly, so that I wasn't getting hate mail from the XO and like the regimental XO, if I wasn't careful. So yeah, I think I definitely stayed in the FOPS lane, probably not as far out as you did, Scott, because I think that's a good consideration between kind of the East Coast. We just could go in the backyard and do training. So as long as RIF miss requests are in, and, other things that take a lot less time horizon to request, the East Coast was a little bit easier on that kind of thing, unless, we made it hard by going to Fort Pickett when we had to. But definitely FOPS, COPS, and then maybe the, 4 chief might be the fire chief, but I guess all 3 of you are. So that's kind of what I have on that.
I will say though, like, when people talk about, sure, 3rd Marines, I would say that is very tough logistics. But on the other hand, the OPSO is so constrained by the 4. I hate to say it like that, but when you're at 7th Marines, your OPSO can say, shut up, 4, we're going to the field tomorrow. And then just make a plan to go to the field tomorrow without, like, you're not doing that at 3rd Marines, because you're not going to the field tomorrow, and he knows it, so there's no walking, there's no hiking, there's no round robining. like if you don't plan this out, then, it's a kind of a forcing function to make the OPSOs. So my point of that is that I don't think one's easier than the other. I think they all have their different challenges, because we had it easy in the fact that my OPSO is not telling me we're going to the field in a week because it's just not going to happen.
What's going to change is we bring in light amphibious warships, landing ship mediums, right? What is that going to change with our mobility, and what's it going to change with our ability to go out and do training? I know, our bridging capability, right, that's coming out there, that's going to change things. That's going to change the way that we're training. Yeah, 3rd Marines, definitely different from the other infantry regiments, and especially now as 3rd Marine Regiment transitions to the 3rd MLR, their mission completely changes. So ammo chief, it's funny you say, one of my best memories of ammo chiefs in the Marine Corps was after one of our ITXs going and getting a Carl's Jr. burger on 29 Palms and just sitting there, Corporal Ammo Chief, and watching him enjoy that burger and smoke a cigarette like outside of Carl's Jr. and just be like, God, this guy got the crap beat out of him for 30 plus days, right? Setting up his ASP and doing all the stuff that he had to do to set it up, just being out there by himself with like 2 other Marines for 30 days, just hanging out in the middle of the desert. Ammo Chief, a thankless job. And then him retrograding all that ammunition out of Afghanistan. That dude did a lot of good work, and I appreciate him. Roles of the 4 different relationships in the 4 shop. So I was never assigned as the S-4. I was always the 4 Alpha or below within a battalion. You stand in and you fill the roles when the 4 is not there, right? When he was on campaign continuity or whatever, that doesn't count. I was just in the 4 shop. But I worked for 3 different S-4s. So 3 different officers in my time that I was at 3-4. All of them had different styles. All of them had different ways of setting up the 4 shop as to how they worked. And I think this is a good opportunity to say, to remind us as logistics officers that it is our job to manage the 4 shop and assign people in the positions and the jobs and the responsibilities that they're capable of and what they can do. I definitely did not understand that as a 4 Alpha. I know, and I am sad about it now as I look back on it. My 4 chief, when I was a 4 Alpha, I definitely did not employ him the way that he should have been employed as a 4 chief. I think that for me, being a much more of a control freak within the 4 shop and having already been on a pump with the battalion and having the relationships that I had, I held a lot of stuff tightly and just wanted to manage everything myself as the 4 Alpha. And my 4 let me do that. And I think that the 4 chief didn't get the experience he could have gotten. He didn't have as much of a role in the battalion as he could have had. He didn't build the relationships with the company gunnies that he could have because I stepped on him as an officer, right? And that's something that I think it was a good lesson for me that I carried to my next billets and understood, like, hey, there's roles for everybody and we need to make sure we build our team and we strengthen our team for the next fight. It's not just about, sometimes it's just about right now. I need the bullets right now and I need to get the transport done or whatever. Probably 90% of the time it's about development and making sure the Marines are ready for their next billet after they leave there. So the 4 Alpha, 4 Chief.
So I've actually not been a 4 Alpha because those opportunities just aren't there in the CLB, and at Mouse 31, you're it. And as I had talked about in the last episode, especially at Mouse 31, I was the only ground officer of 750 people. So you were having to do a lot to convince them what you do provide as services. And this may be my experience only. I don't think it is, unfortunately, because of how quickly the O4 community promotes on the enlisted side. You will typically find folks that don't have that experience and possibly even that maturity. So you have to balance that risk and reward of, do I give them this task knowing that it may not come to fruition? And I only have so much time in the day to be able to give that bumper for that left and right. Or do I continue to develop them? So I think that's something very important as well, especially if you are that one of one, to figure out very quickly, is the juice worth the squeeze here? Or is there another opportunity down the road that I can take to galvanize this individual into the roles and responsibilities that they need to be in? So I think that's very important to take into consideration. It sounds like y'all had phenomenal chiefs, and sometimes you're just not that blessed. So you have to just balance that risk and reward.
I think Jess said it perfect right there with risk and reward. And I mean, this probably gets us into another topic that we're going to talk about. But I mean, Dan said the same thing, so it's kind of rolling into it. And you said it. when you talk about managing and leadership, and you're bound, what missions do you give this person? Like that, I'm with Dan. I have a young ammo guy. I'm a major. Guess what I'm going to be doing during the reserve ITX? I'm going to be at the ASP. And then I'm not going back to Wilson. That's what my alpha's for. He's better on computers anyway. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to be doing, like, that's what I'm going to do as a major. I'm going to help count bullets for the brand new lat move, corporal that's going to be there. And that's just the mission, because that's something you're not going to risk. Whereas some stuff like, hey, we have an FPC coming up. It's all pretty much planned at this point. Very different than active duty side on the reserve side. I can send a gunny or staff sergeant or captain, let him get some reps. It's very low risk, and anything that's going to come out of that it's not effectual to the success of the battalion. So
we'll switch topics now to the quote that everybody talks about. Amateurs talk about strategy and tactics. Professionals talk about logistics and sustainability in warfare. That usually gets simplified, right? But it was originally said by Robert Hilliard Barrow, right? He was a Marine Corps commandant, if I'm not mistaken. He died in 2008. This is something that gets rubbed in the face, I feel like, with a lot of people that are not logistics officers, and we try and push this in their faces and say well, you got to think about logistics. This is a really good time in the Marine Corps for us as loggies, because logistics is the pacing function, right? There's all these cool videos now and everybody's talking about logistics. It's one of the reasons why I think this podcast is really important, because it should be helping to get people excited about being logistics officers, right? There's a lot of Marine lieutenants, hopefully, that eventually makes it into the ether, guys at TBS, gals at TBS that are listening to it and trying to figure out what MOS they want to go into. And I remember getting a brief at TBS about what being a logistics officer is like and being very demotivated, not wanting to be a logistics officer, and thinking that sounds horrible. This is hopefully a different perspective, right? This should give a different way of looking at being a logistics officer. And I hope it excites people about being a logistics officer and doesn't just scare them about going to prison if you lose a weapon or accidentally sell pieces from the armory to somebody out in town on eBay. I don't know any logistics officers that did that. That's a whole other story of how that transpired in 29 Palms, California. Okay.
I threw that one out there because I think Colonel Hughes said it best. Brian Hughes, I don't know if he even remembers this quote, but he said, it's not that whole professionals talk logistics thing. It's that professional logisticians talk tactics. And I think what I've found from, the logistics officers that I admire and that are successful and who I want to be like, is that you have some logisticians, and let's just bring up there's some SAL grads that can if you can talk tactics along with the tactics guy or gal, and you can talk logistics, now you're dangerous. Now you're adding value to the community and to the warfighter. And probably one of the best operations officers I've ever worked for. He felt the same way. His thing, and he's an infantry guy, was infantry is easy. It's 2 up, 1 back, or 1 up, 2 back. It doesn't matter. You're doing the same thing. But getting the people there and how you're sustaining them, that's the fun problem to solve. So me and him used to go back and forth. And my thing is, if you understand how 81s need to bound or not bound at certain times, that tells you what type of equipment set you can use organically. If you could tell me, what their rate of fire is going to be during this elevation of combat without them having to send a request, then you have an idea of what type of capabilities you need to build for your external support requests. So very small, if you can get those small details of tactics right, you can just be that much more valuable to your OPSO.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things in all of the war games we've been doing, thankfully, I'm not the one who does logistics every time. But for the concept of logistics support, this last go around, it was a pilot and a tracker. And immediately they came to me and were like, what do we do? And it was Indo-PACOM. I was like, well, conveniently, I do have a Kohl's from before, but that's just a Kohl's. So that doesn't go into the explanation that of what's going on, where, who, what, when. They were like, what's a WRM? What's an APU? What's this? So after the fact, they came to me and they were like, why don't we war game logistics? Because it drove everything else they could and could not do for the rest of that war game. And I was like, actually, we're doing a better job of it. We are trying to do more of that to understand. And it's funny for the whole, or amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And that Eccles book I mentioned last week, or the first podcast, it actually says in there, it's the commander's responsibility to understand their requirements, not vice versa. So that is another important reason why you need to be able to understand how you're supported. So that way you can accurately translate that to the supporter who can give you what you need.
Go back to Locke and think, everything that was drilled into us is that logistics is in support of operations. Operations drives logistics. And that's the whole mantra of me being a logistics officer in an infantry battalion, everybody telling us that, the three can come up with an idea right now and you need to figure out how to support it. And like that was the spirit, that was the attitude of what I grew up with. And yeah, we will find solutions. We will solve whatever problem you have, sir. Like, as we now start looking at the future of Marine Corps employment, how much of our operations are now driven by contested logistics? How much of what we are capable of doing and can do is going to be hampered or enabled by logistics? And it'll be a really interesting conversation as it goes back and forth with, yeah, we want to do these things. We want to get to this desired future state, but we just don't have the equipment, the assets, the manpower or whatever to do it. I think that we're in an interesting time in the Marine Corps where we're trying to figure out how all that stuff fits together.
I kind of wanted to say, I agree with Scott in a way. I disagree a little bit, but I think it also becomes more important when you're saying, I don't know if you have to speak tactics, but you definitely have to understand it. And right now with, FD 2030 and everything changing, the tactics side of the house doesn't even understand what they're doing sometimes. So they're still all figuring it out. But I think that means, like, if you're a logistician right now, you can't just put your head in the sand and just do logistics and not be worried about, whatever's coming, because if you don't pay attention, pretty soon you're going to be in a spot where you're going to have to be thinking about something that you are way behind the curve. If you're still thinking about, 1 up and 2 back in 2027, you're going to be left in the dust. But I think that's some kind of a distinction there. And sometimes we do kind of put it, we shove it in people's faces a lot of the times and poke with the whole, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And I got a whole soapbox on some of that stuff too, probably for later. But that was one point I want to make, was the 2030 fight. And then, for a logistician, if you're checking into an infantry battalion like this summer as the 4 or one of the lieutenants in the 4, it's funny what you said, Kevin. If the 3 says jump, the 4 says how high, like that kind of battalion, like that's just wrong. I mean, you're going to notice that the morale of the Marines in the 4 is just beat down, because if there's no one sticking up for them and no one telling, the OPSO and the CO, like, this is what we can and can't do, this is the expectation for reality, then, your Marines are just going to be hurting. And that was what I checked into when I checked into my battalion. And I didn't really know why at the time. I took some figuring out, but eventually I kind of like pieced some things together and went, oh, this is why things are the way they are. So that's definitely something to think about, is you have to kind of know what's going on. Because another thing too is you can't call the OPSO or someone on their kind of cracked up plan if you don't even know if it's good or bad, right? Because you don't know a squat about it. So anyway, that's just kind of one of my spiels for like the company grade, the logistician that's supporting is, it's not always like that. And you have to understand where the Marines fit in too, because sometimes the effect is downrange. It goes down to second, third, fourth order effects. So, but that, yeah, definitely a good point with, FD 2030 there, Kevin, because it's a lot is changing right now.
The only other thing I would add is, I would say, especially as a young logistician, adopting a motto of yes, I can every time is not necessarily a bad thing. So that way, the one time you say, no, I cannot, there's not a lot of pushback. because you have done the risk and reward analysis. And as long as you can articulate that according to the plan that's being presented, you'll probably be taken seriously. I think what comes with experience and maturity, though, is being able to go to that commander and go, hey, sir, I can absolutely support this, but this is the risk that you are eating when you decide to go ahead and do this. So I think that is really important to remember as well. But that's something that just may come with experience, maturity, and time.
That concludes episode 2, part 1 of our Infantry Battalion S-4 episode. We have at least 2 more parts to this episode. We'll release those episodes throughout the next couple weeks as we come out with more episodes.